Hi, it's Scott Allen and welcome to part 2 of our year-end wrap for Let's Talk Rugby. Elisha, the ARU have made it very clear that if players aren't playing in Australia in Super Rugby, they won't be eligible for the Wallabies next year. So that's going to rule out guys like James O'Connor, Matt Giteau, Sedileki Tamani, Dan Palmer, Peter Kimlin and a bunch of others probably. But there are a number of guys who have played for the Wallabies previously and have been part of the setup this year but were injured for the large part of the year. Guys like David Pocock, Scott Higginbotham, Wycliffe Palu, Kurtley Beale, Hugh McMenamin. There's a fair bit of experience with those players, and they probably would have been in the test teams earlier in the year but for the injury. But they haven't been part of this rebuilding that the Wallabies have been going through. Do you think that they're going to come back into the team next year or come into calculations?
I think from quality point of view, at least Pocock and Higginbotham have shown that they can sustain the quality needed over a season. I don't know about Palu anymore. I wouldn't say that that's a given now. If Pocock and Higginbotham show the same sort of form they did before they were injured, given that Palu's injuries have been an ongoing thing. And as we said before, there's sort of this delicate setup in the Australian back row in particular right now where it's not just the 6, 7 and 8 like you normally pick in a team. There's this roles diversion that's a little bit different to what it has been in the past. So it's obviously going to be tougher for them to make their way back into the team. They're going to have to not just do their own role that they've always done, but be able to learn the new one. One thing that was interesting, I thought, was Pocock was supposed to be adding the kind of things to his game that Hooper has displayed in the last year. Now that Hooper's had a chance to display them properly for the Wallabies, then possibly it's going to take Pocock a lot longer than most people think to get the starting jersey back for a start. And Higginbotham, I think, will probably compete with Moen more than Fardy because Higginbotham has something completely different to the game than what Fardy can. So it's going to be interesting in the back row in particular because 2 years ago, Pocock, Higginbotham and Palu were probably considered the best back row in Australia in terms of balance, and maybe not even 2 years ago, maybe just 1 year ago that was the case. So it'll definitely be interesting. In the back line, I think probably Kurtley Beale is the most interesting player because it's easy to forget that he's only 24 years old, given everything he's gone through. And possibly 2010 and 11, only him and Israel Dagg were in the class of their own in terms of fullbacks around the world, and you wouldn't think that Beale couldn't reach that level of skill and speed again if he dedicated himself to it. So here's to hoping that he's doing that in this amount of time that he's had off. I wrote an article earlier in the year that basically turned into a long discussion on the amount of injuries that Kurtley Beale has suffered since that 2011 World Cup. He's basically not been on the field injury-free since that time. He's either been recovering or just about to have another injury. And even then the personal issues he's had off the field. So I would hope that Kurtley Beale is able to make a huge case for his own selection next year, given the amount of time he's had to get himself right physically and mentally in the last he probably gets the best off-season of any of those high-class players now.
And what about Christian Leali'ifano? I mean, obviously Matt Tamua grabbed his opportunity at 12. You would think that Quade Cooper is a lock-in at 10 if he plays well in Super Rugby at the moment. Nothing's set in stone, but you'd think that he'd probably be right up there. One thing I did notice about Leali'ifano, if you look at the season, an 81% success rate in goal kicking, Quade Cooper at 71%. Do we need that extra 10%? Have we got to find a place for him somewhere?
At international level, I think you need the 10%. I think you do. But I think they'll ask Cooper to find it. I think they'll expect him to be able to add that to his game over the off-season or however long it takes, because I think in the long run, Tamua's the better number 12. I just think they'll ask Cooper to find it at first before they decide they have to include possibly a lesser player. I mean, he's not the same type of player, but it's like adding Mike Harris to the team last year at times. Mike Harris, in my view, is not an international quality number 12, but we needed him in the team for those kicking qualities. I don't think you can expect to beat the All Blacks and the South Africans constantly or consistently even if you have a player in the team that it's not the best player in his position around the park because he can kick. I just don't think that's going to be possible. So I think Leo Lafano is a great kicker and a great Super 15 player, but he needs to actually beat Tamua around the park to make a strong case for him being picked in my eyes.
Yeah. Brett, where do you see things going with these other players that aren't in the team at the moment?
Yeah, I sort of touched on this again on Tuesday. I had a little subheading of depth and competition, and said that it's one thing that Mackenzie can absolutely be proud of in his first year, and that he has actually created a lot of genuine competition around the board. And I made the point in a few comments that with the possible exception of scrum half and fly half, and scrum half particularly, you could stack up 4, maybe 5 genuine options in most positions around the field. I think scrum half and even hooker now, just thinking about that while I've said it, is probably a little bit thin, but otherwise there is actually now starting to be a little bit of depth, and that's really good. That then feeds into Elisha's point about these long-term injury guys like Higginbotham and Pocock coming back into the side. And I think from a quality point of view, I don't think there's much doubt that they will come in. However, the guys that have performed really well in these positions at this late end of the year are going to make their return just that much harder, and that's a fantastic thing, from all angles. The other end to that is that you could then look at players like Kyle Godwin and Henry Spate, who we've been penciling them in for the best part of 6 months as definite Wallabies. These blokes will absolutely play for Australia in the next 3, 6, 12 months. All of a sudden now, even those guys who are absolutely at the peak of the game in Super Rugby this year, Godwin's got to get over the top of Leilofano and Tamua. Spate's got to get over the top of Cummins and Tamani and Folau, depending on where things end up. And I just think it's a fantastic point to be where the first selection of 2014 for Ewan McKenzie is going to be a whole lot harder than his last selection this year. And I also made the point that the National Rugby Championship, if it does come in next year, is only going to help that even more. So I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a great thing that we've got that competition, and those guys are going to have to step up enormously in Super Rugby to earn a spot, which is, as you say, a fantastic thing.
Yeah, absolutely. If we've got 2 or 3 or 4 guys around the country who are all genuine Wallaby options, they can only push themselves to play better. It really is a good thing. It really is.
Yeah. Just on that, just a little point off that. I mean, specifically, for instance, you brushed on it, Brett. What's going to happen with Israel Folau next year, considering the New South Wales Waratahs setup? I mean, how Folau is either used on the wing or outside centre, or maybe it's still at fullback, given how good he's played, and where does that leave Kurtley Beale and things like that? I think the national setup needs to work really hard with making sure that the right players get the right development at the right positions during Super Rugby this year. I think it's critical. If we have a really good year at Super Rugby and the players take another step up collectively with the aim of getting selected for the Wallabies, we could really be setting ourselves up to try and win this next World Cup. But if we don't again, and then another new lot of players are coming back into the Wallabies by the end of next year because they got shuffled around at Super Rugby level, I think we'll be caught in the same position we were again sort of 2 years ago.
The Folau situation actually came up in the comments under my piece on Tuesday, and become a little discussion in itself. And there was almost universal agreement, I'd say, that the Waratahs moving him to outside centre, as seems to be likely, almost feels like weakening his strength. And it would be interesting then to see where Folau still fits in the Wallabies game, because I don't think anyone disagrees that he wouldn't do well at 13, but the point of that is that how much of his aerial game, how much of his counter-attacking game would we actually lose? How much of him injecting himself into the back line off Quade Cooper's inside hip do we actually lose by playing him in that 13 channel? So I think there needs to be a little bit of smart thinking about that. It almost feels like the Waratahs are going to move him to 13 in order to accommodate Beale at 15. And maybe that's not actually in Australia's best interest to do that. Maybe it's in Australia's best interest, and even in Beale's best interest, to make him fight for a starting spot wherever it happens to come up from the bench.
That's what I think so too. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if the individual states are going to work those things around. I've got views about with the inside backs at the Brumbies too. They're different to yours, but there's going to be those type of little things that crop up all around the country next year. Now there's some severe competition coming up.
Yeah, it's good. And Scott and I had this chat on this very program a few weeks ago about how the Brumbies see Tamua Leilofano working differently to how the Wallabies see Tamua running at 12.
Yeah, and I'll come back to Elisha's point about the back row. I mean, it's been great that we've done really well on the end-of-year tour, but we haven't played the All Blacks and the Springboks, who are now, and they've always had, but even more so now, they have a power back row. And we are going to have to match them. We just cannot go into the breakdown against those two teams. We will get turned over unless we are very physical. So, look, I think, and everything is subject to Super Rugby performance, but I think David Pocock will still be, as long as he's performing, the number one choice at 7.
I agree.
Because of his physicality.
Particularly for the Rugby Championship. I'd certainly agree with that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, those sort of tough, really hard combative battles is what we're going to face in the World Cup. That's what happens in World Cups. Everybody tightens up. It gets more physical. It's less open. So, look, I think Pocock is still the natural number 1 7 that we have in the country. We don't have George Smith anymore. If we had him, I'd still say he's number 1. Hooper is going to add so much, but it'll be from the bench. The interesting thing then comes at, where does Moen fit in? Moen's the current captain. I don't think there's many people would argue that he has performed well at 8. It's not his best spot. He performs better at 6. I don't think he's the number 8 we need. But is he going to dislodge Fardy? I don't see it. I don't see anybody dislodging Fardy from 6. I don't care what.
There's all sorts of thoughts on this. There's thoughts that you could move Fardy into lock, so you could move Moen into blindside, so you could bring Higginbotham into 8. I think Fardy is a natural blindsider, and even when he was playing lock for the Brumbies, I thought blindside was his best spot. Funnily enough, I actually think Moen played very, very well at 8 for the Brumbies, but he seems to be playing in a different pattern or a different shape for the Wallabies, and I agree, it doesn't seem to have brought out the best in his game. So that certainly becomes an interesting question. I'll throw in the curveball of Palu into that as well. And Elisha touched on this a little bit before. I don't think Palu's anywhere near a walk-up starter anymore. I think possibly you could make an argument for him being a 20-minute impact player to close out games. But I don't see a massive.
I don't think he's fast enough.
Yeah.
He's just not fast enough for the Test rugby anymore, I don't think.
Yeah, and that's exactly my concern. And that's why I say maybe there's an argument for him to use him as an impact player off the bench. But I think, I think it's a little bit like Tamani. I don't know that the impact is actually that great.
Yeah, definitely. I think we'll see Higginbotham and Palu competing for 8. Again, dependent on form. And I think we'll see, primarily Moen and Fardy competing for 6, because I think Ewan McKenzie understands the lesson that, I think he probably made the mistake when he tried to play James Horwell at 6 in the first couple of games of 2011 in Super Rugby. You don't take a player who's performing really well in one position and move them to accommodate somebody else. That player that you accommodate has to be extraordinary. And why would you take Fardy, who's playing so well at 6, and move him to accommodate a player? And there's no player that's playing better than him at 6. So I think Fardy will be the number 1 contender for 6. Moen, I think, is going to have to win that position off him. Higginbotham, Palu at 8, and look, I agree with what Uncle said earlier. I think it's Pocock and Hooper at 7. Gill, who I think is a fantastic player, but he may be one of those players who ends up in that generational gap where he comes up against 2 other extraordinary players who are in front of him.
Absolutely, Scott. If I could just talk a little bit more about a number 8 position, and I certainly take on board what everyone said. But who came second in this year's John Eales medal? I think it was a bloke by the name of Cliff Parlow, and he got those votes off 3 tests. And that's the guys voting for him. And I agree that Parlow is injury prone, and I see all the downside of Parlow, but I don't think he's done with the Wallabies yet. And it's very interesting the language that Coach Mackenzie's using by not guaranteeing Ben Mowen the captaincy next year. I think he has used Mowen exceptionally well as his culture captain to make this change that the Wallabies needed, as Jake White did with the Brumbies. I get the feeling that Mowen's time as captain may be up, and Coach Mackenzie's looking at that big ball running 8, or that we're never going to get a Kieran Reid, and we shouldn't be trying to find one. We should be trying to find the number 8 that suits our game. And what we didn't see from Cliff so much in that British Lions series was how damaging he can be with a ball in hand, because he was just doing a mountain of work in the tight. Now that we've got a guy like Scott Fardy, who's a real worker in there, and Hall's getting his working game back, and Rob Simmons, I've been really impressed with his work rate. We're going to get some pigs in there that can really do a lot of the work that Parlow was doing during that Lions series. And I just like the idea of him working off Quade Cooper or Matt Tamua. Even just the threat of him taking the ball up is going to attract defenders that just simply Ben Mowen can't do. So I'm not willing to consign Cliff Parlow to the history books just yet. Higginbotham has the ability to be a very, very good number 8, and he was showing that form in the Super Rugby this year with Melbourne. But I distinctly remember him being absolutely manhandled by Kieran Reid in Brisbane because he just runs too tall. And to be a really effective number 8, you've got to get that body height down when you're hitting the line. And my big criticism of Scott's game is when he does hit the line, he's often, if we do get the ball back, it's slow recycle. And I think that body height and contact is something he's really going to have to work on if he's going to be a good ball running 8.
Absolutely. Brett, we've only beaten teams in this run that we've had that are ranked lower than us on the ROB rankings. So are we getting ahead of ourselves? Have we really progressed that much? Or are we on track? And what do we need to improve to keep progressing?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. You're absolutely right. At no point in 2013 did the Wallabies beat anyone ranked higher than them. They've got back to third by virtue of beating Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England losing a couple of games as well to drop them back to fourth. So certainly in that regard, maybe we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in that we haven't really beaten those top-notch teams and the teams that we most likely mark ourselves against, if you like. But at the same time, I think the way that the Wallabies have finished the year, the style of game they're playing, the hardness of the breakdown, the reasonably stable scrum, the excellence, the excellent line out, I think the way that they've finished it with the attacking intent and everything, we can certainly see they are coming along nicely, and they're playing a style that makes us want to watch them, and that in itself is something. Even if you go back only as far as the couple of losses to South Africa, as you mentioned before, the Wallabies weren't much chopped back then, and it was hard slog to get up to watch that game in Cape Town, for example, and they got absolutely pantsed in that. Right now, and I think, Uncle, you put this to me, if it wasn't this week just gone, it was last week, would we like to flip the season around and finish with the Lions series, and how would we go? And I think I said to you then that I'm absolutely sure we'd finish with a better win record. We may or may not win the Bledisloe or the Rugby Championship, but I'd be pretty confident the Wallabies would have won the Lions series to finish. And that's the mark of where the team's progressed, if you like. They have absolutely got better in terms of how they're playing, how they're structured, how they're setting themselves up, even how they're preparing. And so that can only bode well going into 2014. Of course, the big hassle in that now is that we don't play anyone now until June when the Frenchies arrive. So, what have we got to do to keep moving forward? We've just got to keep getting better. So they really need to beat France, probably 3-0 if we're completely honest with ourselves next June. They need at least 2, ideally 3 Super Rugby teams in the final 6, so that by the time the Rugby Championship and the Bledisloe comes around, we're picking players that have literally just played tough, hard knockout rugby last week, and they're hitting the ground running when it comes to the international season come next July.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Brett. I'm not going to, mate. I love hitting you up with your hypotheticals, but
they've been really good questions, and it's been an interesting exercise in itself.
Mate, I appreciate. Look, I think it's good to think laterally in anything that you do, especially in your rugby. But as I said very early on in the piece, we can't play yesterday's game. So
no.
I think the break that we're not going to be playing any Test rugby until June, July next year is an absolute blessing. And in a perfect world, I'd like to see a lot of these guys actually maybe miss 2 or 3 rounds of Super Rugby just to manage the body and really work our way into that French home series. If we can dust those blokes 3-0, and you never know what you're going to get with the French. I mean, they could send down a 94 team like they sent down to New Zealand, and they could absolutely stuff us. Or we could drill them. But we just need to prepare the way we need to prepare for them. And I just think the guys need to rest mentally. And I'd like to see the guys get just across the board about 5% fitter and stronger. I just think we're just short of being that razor fit that will see us home at the end of a game, which we did do, obviously, against the Welsh. But when we're going to be taking on the might of the Springboks and the All Blacks, one thing we have in our control is our fitness, and we really need to get razor fit if we're going to compete.
Fitness was an area that the Brumbies particularly worked on. Dean Benton had them conditioned to peak on the last weekend of the season. They had it set so that they would be playing in the final and they would be at peak fitness by then, and it absolutely served them well. Ultimately, they did fall over in their last sort of 15 20 minutes of the final by virtue of the fact that they'd travelled 35,000 kilometres in the 3 weeks previous. But that needs to be the mindset across the board in Super Rugby. And this is a topic that we might remember Rocky Elsom had some comments on 2 or 3 months ago, and I wrote a bit of an article on at the time that maybe this is where the national interest and the conditioning of players actually needs to come from a national level. And you could extrapolate that out to game plan and set piece and things like that as well. But certainly in terms of fitness and injury prevention and recovery and all that sort of thing, probably needs to be more certainly managed better across the board. I don't think we can have the 5 super teams managing that sort of thing, using their own methods and all that. I think injury prevention and recovery and the management of workloads particularly is something that needs to be an across-the-board approach, and we only need to look at New Zealand as the perfect way of doing that.
I agree with the fitness and the management of that coming from a national level as well. Because you look at, the caveat to everything we've discussed tonight with the Wallabies is that New Zealand and South Africa are clearly a step above everyone else in world rugby right now. And I think it is because of that fitness where they can just switch a gear when they sense an opportunity, like Australia just can't quite, because they're a little bit lagging in the fitness, and that switches through to your mental game. Because you see when South Africa even gets into a scoring position these days, they actually increase in speed as they get closer to the line and make it really hard for the other team to get back into it. And the All Blacks do that usually within 1 or 2 phases as well. They switch that gear to the next level, whereas Australia hasn't quite got that down yet. And if they got a little bit fitter, I think they'd be able to pull that gear sooner.
Guys, that's a great discussion. I want to finish up tonight by asking each of you what's been your Wallabies highlight for the year. So, Elisha, let's start with you.
The best. Wow. Look, I think just the last couple of games has been a return to sort of the confidence, and it's the confident attacking game has just been so good to watch. It's a cliche, but I suppose entertaining rugby makes people want to watch rugby. So I'm pleased that there's a product there that I can tell my mate to watch, and I can guarantee him at the moment that the Wallabies are going to give him a good show. In terms of just a highlight for the year, it's a little bit quirky, I suppose, but the what if that I came up with is, what if Kurtley Beale's foot hadn't slipped?
Yeah, well,
that would have been an amazing thing to think about in depth. I mean, the ongoing ramifications of that foot slip are amazing when you think about it. The coaching turnover, the obvious lift the Lions got from winning the first game. Game 3 wouldn't have even mattered. How we went into, James O'Connor playing a fly half, things like that. It's phenomenal to think about what would have happened if that foot hadn't have slipped out from under that tee.
There's a hypothetical for you, Uncle.
Oh, look, it's a huge hypothetical. But that obviously changed it. I remember being there at Suncorp, looking gun barrel down at that kick and just shaking my head afterwards, not thinking that would have such an impact as it did. But I mean, if that went over, we don't know how the Lions would have responded in Melbourne, and we're just going down too many rabbit holes there. As I said, you can't play yesterday's game. We just have to accept that we were beaten by a much better British Lions team over the 3 tests, and certainly by the Springboks and the All Blacks. And mate, the losers will keep dwelling on that one, but the guys who are going to win the 2015 World Cup, they're thinking about France in June, and that's where we need to be mentally.
So, Uncle, what was your highlight?
Ewan McKenzie being made Wallaby coach. Certainly, I have to say, with all due respect to Robbie Deans, I think he has handled himself with absolute aplomb for the way he was treated after reading the article by Andrew Blades. I don't think anyone to a person who's ever met Robbie Deans thinks he's a bad guy, but the time had come for him to move on, and I think the guys can really learn, the current Wallaby guys, if they can learn anything about the departure of Robbie Deans, it's not what happens to you in life, it's how you deal with it. And Robbie's just done that so well. And, I'm sure everyone in Australian rugby wishes him well, but the highlight for me was that the change had to come. We were getting stale, and it had to happen. And I'm personally glad that Ewan McKenzie got the spot, because I really believe he's the right guy moving forward.
Brett, what have you got for us?
I'll just mention the Lions series as a bit of a general highlight. The result was, horrible, but the Lions series was just a wonderful event for 3 weeks, and it absolutely put rugby front and back pages across the country. We had three completely packed out stadiums. The Stadium Australia crowd in Sydney for about a week was a ground record. And it was just a fantastic atmosphere. I've certainly never experienced anything like that from a rugby point of view. But my actual Wallaby highlight for this year is those first 2 tries against Ireland, to Cummins and to Hooper. And we've touched on them before, but they're a highlight for me because of the interchange of play between backs and forwards. In both cases, you had forward standing at fly half. I mentioned Steve Moore stood at 10 for one of them, for Hooper's try, I think it was. But ultimately, they came from really, really good interchange between the forwards and the backs. It was forwards that made the break. They offloaded inboard to a back, to Cummins and to Hooper in his case. And they were just really, really well-worked, well-executed tries that sort of came from not necessarily a whole lot, but they were just well thought out. Passes were given at the right time. Angles were straightened at the right time. Offloads came at the right time. The ball stuck, and they were fantastic passes, and may there be more of it next year.
All right, well, my highlight is not one that many people would pick, and it wasn't until I was working through this highlights video that I've been doing that I saw this, and it had skipped my mind, quite frankly, but when I saw it again and having looked back at what I've seen subsequently, I realised that this is probably the turning point of the whole season. And I think the improvement in the Wallabies has been that they're playing with real confidence. And defence is a really important part of the game, but confidence comes from being able to attack. Now, the view that no matter what the opposition does, we can score more than you. So attack is really important. And once you've got confidence from attack, your defence improves as well. So the moment for me that it finally clicked with the Wallabies in their attack the 78th minute of the second Rugby Championship match against the Springboks. The Wallabies get a penalty on their own line. Cooper takes a quick tap and throws a long ball to Tamua, who makes a great long break downfield. At the ensuing ruck, the Boks infringe, and then Cooper takes another quick tap. But he kicks it across field to Feiwai Sautuia, who scores his first ever test try in the corner. And it caught everybody off guard. Up until that point in the season, just about everything the Wallabies had tried in terms of offloads, miraculous passes, quick taps, apart from Will Genia's one in the Lion series, had gone pear-shaped. All of a sudden, the ball stuck. They scored. Sure, they didn't win the match, and they were completely outplayed in that match. But all of a sudden, things started to happen. And since then, passes have been sticking. There's been a little bit of confidence because they went from that game into the match against Argentina, and obviously that helped build their confidence. And on the end-of-year tour, we've seen that confidence grow and grow. So, in hindsight, to me, that was the highlight for the year.
That's a good one. I've used that Argentina game as a bit of a benchmark on the season. That's almost the line in the sand game of where things started clicking. But you're absolutely right, Scott. It's probably come from that week before, hasn't it?
If I could add to that, Scott, if we're going to talk about a seminal moment, a point that I take on board what everyone says, and I think they're great points. But for me, the win over Italy after the scrum went through what we endured against England, that strong Italian scrum, we weren't too sure how we were going to stack up against it. And those opening 10 minutes were dreadful. And then, as you say, it just clicked. And scrum stood up, the attack stood up, everyone mentally switched on. And we saw this fly half finally come out of Stephen Moore's body, which I think any respecting front row would love to play like that. But it just clicked, and that was the turning point of the tour. And this tour, I think we would all agree, has set the Wallabies up for hopefully a great 2014. But the turn in that Italian game to say, okay, what are we going to do here, guys? And they did it. And for me, that 50-20 result against the Italians really started the inertia towards what ended up in Cardiff.
All right, gents. Thanks very much for your time tonight. Uncle, great to have you on and finally put a voice to the name that's been writing so much on the Raw.
It's been my absolute pleasure, Scott, and it's great talking rugby with you guys.
Elisha, thanks for coming on. I know you've been sort of rushed just getting back from holidays.
No, that's no problem, Scott. Thanks for having me.
And Brett, thanks once again, a regular visitor.
Frequent flyer points. They're stacking up nicely, mate. But thanks for having me. It's been a fantastic chat, this one. It really has. So,
and thanks to everyone for listening and watching. That's the final episode of Let's Talk Rugby for 2013. Hope you've enjoyed it. Have a great Christmas. Talk to you in 2014.